February 3rd, 1889, Belle Starr was shot in the back on a dirt road in Indian Territory 2 days before her 41st birthday. The case was never solved, and one of the suspects was her own son. In her entire life, the Bandit Queen was convicted only once. The rest became legend. Here are the 22 facts the movies left out. Number 1. Myra Maybelle Shirley, the real beginning. Before she became a Wild West legend, Belle Starr was just a girl named Myra Maybelle Shirley. She was born on February 5th, 1848, in a small town called Carthage, Missouri. And get this, her family was not poor. Her father started out running an inn and later became a farmer. In other words, they had more than enough money to put food on the table. What few people know is that this young woman actually received a real education. She attended the Carthage Female Academy, a formal school at a time when hardly any women ever set foot in a classroom. She learned to play the piano, knew a few words of Greek and Latin, and for the region where she lived, she was considered a well-educated young woman. Nothing about that peaceful childhood pointed to the path she would eventually take. No one around her imagined what that well-mannered girl was about to become. Number 2. The Civil War and her brother, Bud. This is where Belle's story starts to take a different turn. She had an older brother named John Shirley, but everyone called him Bud. When the Civil War broke out, Bud did not stay on the sidelines. He joined Quantrill's Raiders, a band of guerrilla fighters who fought for the Confederacy and became known for fast, bloody attacks across Missouri. But the war took its toll. In 1864, Bud was killed in combat. And for Belle, who was still young, it was a blow she never forgot. Many people who tell this story point to her brother's death as the moment something changed inside her. From then on, Belle supposedly became firmly hostile toward the Union and started getting close to Confederate fugitives. To be honest, there is no document proving that direct connection. What is known is that one thing happened right after the other, and her life was never the same again. Number 3. Jim Reed. First husband, first fugitive. Wouldn't you know it? Belle ended up with a man who was already in trouble with the law. Jim Reed was already a fugitive when the two of them got married. He became her first husband, and together they had 2 children, a daughter, Pearl, born in 1868, and a son, Eddie, the following year, in 1869. But living with a fugitive has consequences. In August 1874, Reed's luck ran out. He was killed by a lawman. Belle was only 26 years old, and overnight she found herself a widow with 2 young children to raise and no steady money coming into the house. There is one detail that makes a lot of people raise an eyebrow. Belle did not show up at her own husband's funeral. And it is not just a rumor. The records show that she was in another town that day. Whether it was by choice or by chance, no one can say for sure. The fact is that she was left alone, with 2 children in her arms and her whole life still ahead of her. Number 4. Sam Starr, the marriage that gave her the name. Now we come to the man who gave Belle the last name that went down in history. In 1880, she married Sam Starr, a member of the Cherokee Nation, who lived in what was known as Indian Territory, the land that is now the state of Oklahoma. And here is a clever detail. The marriage was valid under Cherokee law, but the United States did not formally recognize it until many years later. For Belle, this was more than a signed piece of paper. Marrying Sam opened the doors to Cherokee Territory, a place where American federal law had much less reach. In other words, it became quite a refuge for anyone living on the wrong side of the law. It was around this time that she stopped being Myra Shirley and became Belle Starr, the name the entire country would soon learn. But even this marriage did not last long. In '86, Sam Starr was killed in a shootout, and Belle once again found herself on her own. Number 5. Younger's Bend Ranch, base of operations. This is where the story really gets interesting. Belle and Sam Starr lived on a piece of land along the Canadian River in Indian Territory, and the place had a name, Younger's Bend. And it was not just any name. It was a tribute to Cole Younger, an old family friend and one of the most notorious fugitives of that time. But that ranch was not just used for raising cattle. It became a regular stop for outlaws on the run. Men wanted by the law would stop there to rest, hide out, and catch their breath before disappearing again. The local sheriff sometimes suspected what was going on, but on Cherokee land, his authority was limited, and there was not much he could do. And here is the part the movies would rather hide. Belle charged for it. It was business, plain and simple. Movies like to portray her as a charitable soul, but the records tell a different story. Anyone who wanted shelter at her hideout had to pay. Number 6. Cole Younger, the rumor that was never proven. If there is one piece of gossip that still sticks to Belle Starr's name today, it is this one. For more than 100 years, people have claimed that Cole Younger, the same man from Jesse James's gang, was the real father of her daughter, Pearl. That is quite a claim, isn't it? The problem starts when you look into who actually told the story. Guess where the story came from? Belle herself. And not in any document, but in casual remarks that other people claimed they had heard her make. Cole Younger never confirmed a word of it. There is not a single record from that time supporting the rumor. And here is the detail almost no one mentions. Pearl never used the last name, Younger, in her life. Even so, movie after movie and series after series repeat the story as though it were a proven fact. But when you separate the legend from what is actually written on paper, there is not much left. It is a good rumor to tell, but a rumor is still a rumor. Number 7. Jesse James, the visit that probably never happened. Since Belle was already connected to Cole Younger and the whole gang, all that was missing was the biggest name of them all, right? And that is exactly what books and movies did. A lot of people swear that Jesse James, the most famous outlaw of the Wild West, spent a long time hiding out at Belle's ranch in Younger's Bend. There's just one problem with that story. There is not a single piece of evidence. When you look at the records from the time, Jesse James shows up in other states during the very years he was supposedly staying there. His name does not appear in any document, testimony, or letter connected to her property. Nothing. So where did this legend come from? From dime novels, those cheap little newsstand books that appeared after both of them were already dead. Putting Belle and Jesse under the same roof made for one heck of a story to sell. But selling a story is not the same as it actually happening. Number 8. The only conviction: stealing an $80 horse. Now, get this, because it is hard to believe. The so-called Queen of the Outlaws, the woman turned into a legend of blood and gunpowder in the movies, was convicted in court only once in her entire life. And it was not for murder or bank robbery, it was for stealing a horse worth $80. This happened in 1883, and the case was handled by none other than Judge Isaac Parker, nicknamed the Hanging Judge because of his harsh rulings. Belle received 2 6-month sentences, but because of good behavior, she ended up serving only 9 months and was released. Stop and think about that for a second. All that fame as a dangerous gunslinger, that reputation as an outlaw woman who terrorized the entire territory, and the record shows only one conviction, an $80 horse. Nearly 40 years of life, and that is all the law managed to prove against her. The legend is huge. The criminal record, very small. Number 9, the second marriage and the trouble that came with it. After Sam Starr was killed in the 1886 shootout, Belle did not stay alone for long. She got together with a man named Jim July Starr. And here is an important note to avoid confusion. Despite having the same last name, this Jim was not related to the late Sam in any way. He was a Cherokee man, much younger than she was, and their relationship was never made official with a legal marriage. But the young man was no saint either. In 889, Jim July was arrested and charged with robbery. And what did Belle do? She hit the road for Fort Smith to try to arrange bail and get her partner out of jail. Now comes the chilling part, and it is all documented. It was on the way back from that trip, made specifically to save her man, that Belle Starr was killed. The irony is cruel. She crossed the territory to help someone and did not live to see how it all ended. It is the kind of timing no one can explain without getting chills. Number 10, the murder, February 3rd, 889. And that was how the legend came to an end, in the most brutal way possible. On February 3rd, 889, Belle Starr was found lying on the road near Younger's Bend. She was just 2 days away from her 41st birthday. The woman who had survived the war, fugitive husbands, and years of living on the wrong side of the law never even got the chance to blow out the candles. And this was no ordinary death. Belle was shot twice in the back with a shotgun. In the back, mind you. Whoever did it did not give her the slightest chance to fight back or look her killer in the eye. It was an ambush, plain and simple. And here is the detail that keeps the case alive to this day. No one was ever convicted. The killer was never officially identified. When the coroner closed the investigation, the conclusion written in the record was brief and chilling. Death at the hands of an unknown person. More than a century later, the mystery remains exactly where it was left. Number 11, her son, Eddie Reed, the main suspect. What if I told you that the main suspect in Belle Starr's murder had been living under her own roof? That's right. The name that drew the most suspicion during the investigation was her own son, Eddie Reed, a young man who was only 19 years old. What made investigators suspect him was what had happened just days earlier. Belle herself had kicked the boy out of the house, and that was not just a rumor. The neighbors saw it and confirmed it. Add to that one serious detail. Eddie owned a shotgun of the exact same gauge used in the crime. The police brought him in for questioning, asked him everything they could, and in the end, they were unable to charge him. There was not enough evidence to close the case, but his own fate was not a happy one either. In 1896, 7 years after his mother's death, Eddie Reed was killed by a police officer while trying to escape another run-in with the law. And here is the mystery no one can untangle. Right up to his final breath, he never confessed to anything. He took the answer with him to the grave. Number 12, the neighbor, Edgar Watson, the second suspect. But her son was not the only name on the list. There was another man a lot of people were suspicious of, a neighboring farmer named Edgar Watson, and he had a very real motive. Watson had a dark past back in Florida, where he had lived before coming to the territory. And Belle, tough as she was, had threatened to speak up and turn him in for what he had done. In other words, that man had a very good reason to want her silenced, just like her son. Watson also owned a shotgun, was also brought in for questioning, and was also released without being charged. Another man who slipped out the back door. And here the story gets chilling again. Years later, after returning to Florida, Edgar Watson killed several people and became a feared man in the area. His end matched his reputation. In 1910, a mob of furious neighbors surrounded him and killed him right there. Number 13, the 89 dime novel, just weeks after her death. Want to know the exact moment the lie was born? It was right here. Belle had barely been buried when a cheap little book appeared on newsstands with an eye-catching title, Belle Starr, the Bandit Queen, or the female Jesse James. Just weeks after her death, talk about opportunism. And here is the problem. The whole thing was made up from beginning to end. The author sat down and invented shootouts that never happened, breathtaking escapes, movie-style romances, and a fearless heroine who had nothing to do with the real woman. No documents, no actual records behind any of it. It was a newsstand story made to sell excitement, and it sold. Hundreds of thousands of copies. That was the damage. All those well-told lies became the official version in the public's mind. It was this invented Belle, not the flesh and blood woman, that Hollywood picked up and repeated for the next 100 years. The legend buried the woman. Number 14, the movie Belle Starr, 1941. What historians say. When Hollywood finally brought Belle Starr to the screen in 1941, audiences enjoyed the result, but historians shook their heads. The movie, starring Gene Tierney in the lead role, is considered by those who study the subject to be almost entirely made up. For starters, it turns Belle into a romantic Southern heroine in the style of Gone with the Wind, full of charm and noble causes. But the real woman was nothing like that. The movie even gets the timeline wrong. It gives the impression that her life ended shortly after the Civil War, when she did not die until 1889. And there is even more that the script swept under the rug. Nothing about her Cherokee husband, nothing about her children, nothing about the ranch that served as a hideout. They replaced the real woman, tough and full of gray areas, with a pretty, polished character. In the end, the movie tells a story that no one can find in the historical records. Number 15, her daughter Pearl. What really happened? And what became of the little girl in all of this, Pearl? Get ready, because her life took a turn no one would expect. Pearl Reed, Belle's daughter, grew up and ended up going into prostitution. Over time, she worked her way up and became a madam, running her own brothel in Fort Smith, Arkansas, under the name Pearl Starr. But pay attention to what she did with that money. Pearl used part of the profits from the business to have an elaborate headstone placed on her mother's grave. And this is not some made-up story. That stone is still standing there today. But her own ending had no glamour at all. In her final years, Pearl lived in poverty and died in 1925, far from any kind of luxury. And here is the bitter irony. The daughter who outlived Belle ended up choosing the very kind of underworld life that Belle herself, despite all her fame as an outlaw, was never actually accused of living. Number 16, Eddie Reed, as an adult, a violent end. Remember, Eddie Reed, the son many people swore had killed his own mother? Well, his life afterward was worthy of a Western ending, and not one of those where the hero rides off into the sunset. The young man never straightened himself out. He became a small-time troublemaker, the kind who was always going in and out of jail. He was arrested more than once, sometimes for being drunk, other times for petty theft. No major robberies, just a man spiraling downhill and getting into one mess after another. And the end came just about the way you might expect. On December 7th, 86, exactly 7 years after Belle's death, Eddie was in the town of Claremore, in Indian Territory, when the law came for him. He resisted arrest, the officer fired, and his story ended right there. Eddie Reed died at only 27 years old, forever taking with him the secret of whether or not he was the one who killed his own mother. Number 17. Younger's Bend. Today, what remains? And what if you were curious to see the place where it all happened? Well, Younger's Bend still exists. That same piece of land that once served as a hideout for fugitives is now located in Haskell County, Oklahoma. But today it is private property with an owner and a fence around it. And there is more. Belle Starr's grave is still there in the middle of that land with the elaborate headstone her daughter Pearl had built. To this day, it attracts people fascinated by her story, a steady stream of curious visitors who want to get close to the legend. The problem is that access is restricted, and not everyone makes it past the gate. But the sad part is what time and disrespect have done to the place. The headstone has been vandalized several times over the years. Thoughtless people chipped off pieces of the stone to take home as souvenirs, as if it were something from a fair. Piece by piece, they kept taking parts of the woman's grave. Number 18. Belle's Guns. The misleading photograph. I bet that if you have ever seen a picture of Belle Starr, it was that one. The serious-looking woman with a revolver at her waist and the expression of someone who would not take disrespect from anyone. It is her most famous photo, taken in 1886, and it is exactly what helped build the legend of her as a gunslinger. But that picture hides a catch. What almost no one stops to think about is that it was taken inside a studio. It was a pose, staged for the portrait, just like people used to put on their Sunday best to have their picture taken. And that gun probably was not even hers. It likely belonged to the photographer and was used as a prop to make the image more striking. Now here is what completely tears down the myth. There is no record of Belle carrying a gun in her everyday life. There is not a single document showing that she ever shot anyone. No shootouts, no duels, no gunfights involving her name. In the end, the feared gunslinger of the Wild West was more photograph than gunpowder. Number 19. How many crimes did she really commit? So, when all is said and done, how many things did the Bandit Queen actually do? If you look at the records, the number is much smaller than her reputation makes it seem. Aside from that 1883 horse theft we already covered, Belle was accused of other things throughout her life. But pay attention to how each story ended. She was accused of receiving stolen property. The result? Case dismissed. She was accused of illegally carrying a weapon in federal territory. Once again dismissed. She was also accused of sheltering fugitives, but that never even turned into a real trial. One after another, the charges fell apart because there was not enough evidence. And that is where the pattern revealing the real story begins to show. There were plenty of fingers pointed at her and a lot of suspicion surrounding her name. But in the end, she had only one conviction in her entire life. In other words, there were more people keeping a close eye on Belle than crimes anyone could actually put down on paper against her. Number 20. Judge Parker, the contradictory relationship. Here is a twist almost no one talks about. Remember Judge Isaac Parker, the so-called hanging judge, the tough man who convicted Belle of horse theft in 1883. Well, he was the very person who made one of the most surprising statements about her. After Belle died, the old judge spoke up and said something that did not fit his hardline reputation at all. According to Parker, out of all the defendants who had appeared before him, Belle had been the most interesting person he had ever tried. And he went even further. He said he believed that woman was more a victim of life's circumstances than a criminal with a bad heart. That statement appeared in a newspaper in 1889. But notice how it disappears from most versions of the story. Anyone who wants to portray Belle as the law's sworn enemy would rather leave that detail out. After all, it does not work very well for a dramatic storyline when the very judge who convicted her ends up becoming something of a defender of hers. Number 21. How the legend was built. Now, it is time to answer the question hanging in the air. How did a woman named Myra Maybelle Shirley become the feared Bandit Queen? The answer is that it did not happen by accident. It was almost like an assembly line, a legend-making factory running at full speed. It started with dime novels, those cheap little newsstand books that were already being published while she was still alive and came back even stronger after her death. Add to that the stories in the National Police Gazette, a scandal magazine that made a living squeezing every last drop out of sensationalism. And every new generation of media stretched the lie a little further, added more spice, until the story became unrecognizable. But there is one detail that sums it all up. None of the major stories that created the myth were written by anyone who had actually known Belle up close. It was people making things up from a distance, piling drama onto a name. The legend grew precisely because the truth was never on the table. Number 22. What the real records show. After going through all of this, we can put together a picture of Belle Starr based on what the records actually say, without any Hollywood embellishment. And what emerges is a very different story. She was a woman who received a real education, became a widow while still young, married a Cherokee man, and ran a property that served as a stop for fugitives, almost certainly charging them for it. In court, she had only one conviction in her entire life, for a minor theft. And then came the end, shot in the back in an ambush that no one ever solved. She was a complicated figure, full of gray areas, difficult to label as either a saint or a monster. And honestly, far less spectacular than any version Hollywood ever sold. In the end, this is what remains. One conviction, one murder, with no one held responsible. A daughter who became a brothel madam, and more than 100 years of movies that made up everything else. The real woman was always smaller than the legend, but much more interesting.